It's just past 5:30 on a Friday evening in March, and across a young, half-built American state, almost nobody is where they'd normally be. Schools are dark, offices shut their doors hours ago, families are home, sitting down to dinner, because it's Good Friday and the whole territory has slowed to a holiday crawl. Nobody standing on a street in Anchorage that afternoon, and nobody mending nets in a quiet fishing village 100 miles away, has the faintest idea that the ground beneath their feet is about to come apart. Within the next 5 minutes, a state will be physically rearranged. A wall of ocean will erase entire communities, and a scientific argument that had dragged on for decades will be settled for good. By the time the shaking finally stops, map makers will have work to do, geology textbooks will need new chapters, and a handful of small towns simply won't exist anymore in the shape they did an hour earlier. To understand how strange and outsized this moment really was, you have to picture Alaska as it existed in early 1964. It had only been a state for 5 years. The whole territory held fewer people than you'd find in one mid-sized American city today, spread across a landmass bigger than Texas, California, and Montana combined. Anchorage was the closest thing to a real city up there, a scrappy, fast-growing town of new storefronts and half-finished construction, still riding the confidence of a place that believed its best years were ahead of it. Down along the coast, Valdez and Seward functioned as working ports, their docks stacked with cargo, their economies tied directly to freighters and fishing boats. Smaller still were places like Cheniga, a native Alaskan village tucked into a quiet bay on Prince William Sound, where life ran on the rhythm of the tides and the fishing calendar rather than any clock. Everyone in these towns trusted the ground under them completely, which is a very human thing to do, since almost nobody in history has had reason to think otherwise. Even the scientists of the day mostly agreed. In 1964, the idea that the continents themselves could drift was still a fringe theory. A handful of researchers were pushing the concept of plate tectonics, but most geology textbooks still described a crust that was basically fixed and permanent. Nobody had solid physical proof of a plate actually diving under another one, and nobody along that Alaskan coastline had ever heard the word tsunami in casual conversation. They talked about tidal waves instead. So that's the world as it stood at 5:35 in the afternoon on March 27, 1964. 1 minute later, everything changed. Deep beneath Prince William Sound, two enormous plates of the Earth's crust had been locked against each other for centuries, one grinding slowly beneath the edge of the other, storing up strain the way a bent branch stores tension before it snaps. On this particular afternoon, that stored energy finally let go all at once. Geologists call the mechanism elastic rebound. Imagine compressing a spring for hundreds of years and then releasing it in a single violent instant. Except this wasn't a single instant. The rupture tore outward along the fault line, unzipping a stretch of ocean floor, roughly the length of the entire state, all within about 4 minutes. That's the reason the shaking went on so unbelievably long. Most earthquakes are over in 10 or 20 seconds. This one kept tearing along hundreds of miles of fault line, while the ground above it kept shaking, minute after minute, in places that should have already stopped moving. In Anchorage, 75 miles from where the rupture began, people first felt a low rolling shudder underfoot, the kind of minor tremor Alaskans had felt plenty of times before. They braced for it to pass the way it always had. Except this time it didn't pass. It grew. The pavement on 4th Avenue, right in the heart of downtown, began to visibly crack and separate. One side of the street dropping nearly 9 feet lower than the other, right in front of people's eyes. Storefronts folded downward with the collapsing pavement. Windows shattered up and down the block. At the airport, the control tower swayed past its structural limits and came down, killing the air traffic controller inside. For 4.5 minutes, an unimaginable stretch of time to anyone crouched in a doorway trying to stay upright. The earth simply refused to hold still. When the shaking finally stopped, the number that came back from seismographs was almost hard to believe. Magnitude 9.2. Only one earthquake ever recorded anywhere on the planet, The 1960 quake in Chile had measured larger. This single event released something like twice the energy of the famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake. It was felt 800 miles away in the Aleutians, felt across the Canadian border into British Columbia, and its energy rippled all the way down to Seattle, where the newly built Space Needle was recorded gently swaying more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter. Lakes as far away as Texas and Louisiana sloshed from the passing seismic waves. The planet itself, quite literally, rang like a bell. Scientists later found the whole Earth had measurably vibrated for days afterward. But in Anchorage, the shaking wasn't even the most dangerous part. The real danger was hiding underground, in the soil itself. Beneath a pleasant residential neighborhood called Turnagain Heights sat a thick layer of fine, waterlogged marine clay, soil that looked completely solid on the surface, but was secretly primed to fail catastrophically under the right kind of stress. When intense, sustained shaking hits saturated fine-grained soil like this, something strange and violent can happen. The individual grains lose contact with each other, and the water trapped between them suddenly bears the entire load instead of the soil itself. Scientists call this liquefaction, and in 1964 it was barely understood at all. In practical terms, solid ground just stops behaving like ground. It flows like a thick liquid. And that's exactly what happened along the bluff at Turnagain Heights. An entire square kilometer of suburban streets and homes simply slid toward the water in a chaotic mess of tilted, broken blocks. As many as 75 houses were caught in that failure, some of them sliding hundreds of feet from where they'd started. Gardens and driveways and living rooms carried downhill together in pieces. Because it was a holiday evening and many families were elsewhere, the death toll there stayed lower than it easily could have been. But the neighborhood itself was gone, and Turnagain Heights would go on to become one of the most studied landslide sites on Earth, a cautionary textbook example that reshaped how engineers test ground before building on it. And still, the deadliest part of that afternoon hadn't even arrived yet. It was gathering, silently, just offshore. The same violent shaking that tore up Anchorage's streets had also ripped loose the underwater slopes beneath several port towns along the coast, Douai, steep piles of sediment that rivers and tides had been quietly stacking up for centuries at the mouths of narrow fjords. When those slopes gave way and slid into the depths, they shoved enormous volumes of water aside all at once, and that displaced water shot upward as a local wave that could reach shore within minutes, sometimes seconds. These weren't the slow, ocean-crossing waves people picture when they think tsunami. They were sudden, close, and utterly without warning, because there was no time for any warning to exist. In Valdez, a freighter had just tied up at the town dock, and a crowd had gathered on the waterfront to watch it get unloaded. A completely ordinary Friday evening scene. Then the entire underwater face of the harbor's sediment delta collapsed and slid into the fjord, dragging the dock and dozens of onlookers down with it. Roughly 30 people at that waterfront lost their lives in moments, swallowed by a wave that was born right at the shoreline where they stood. There was nothing anyone could have done. Valdez survived as a town, but its ground could never be trusted again. It was later rebuilt entirely on more stable land several miles away. The same brutal pattern repeated itself up and down the Sound. In the tiny settlement of Whittier, home to barely 70 people, a local wave rushed ashore and claimed several lives. In Seward, ruptured fuel tanks caught fire even as the sea surged inland across the rail yards, so the town burned and flooded simultaneously. But the single heaviest loss proportionally fell on the small native village of Chenega. Within minutes of the shaking, a wall of water rose out of the darkening sea and swept across the settlement, carrying away nearly every building in its path. Chenega lost close to a third of its entire population in that instant. No siren, no higher ground reached in time. No word in anyone's vocabulary yet for what was happening to them. It would take scientists decades to trace the cause back to a massive underwater landslide, on a slope nobody had ever mapped. Almost every life lost in Alaska that night was claimed by one of these fast, local waves, not by the shaking itself. But the earthquake generated a second, very different kind of wave too. As the sea floor thrust upward across a huge stretch of ocean floor, it lifted the entire column of water above it, and that displaced water spread outward across the Pacific as a broad ocean-crossing wave. Out in open water it was barely noticeable. A long, slow swell a ship might sail straight through without even feeling it. But as that wave approached shallower coastlines farther away, it slowed down and rose dramatically, turning into a surge capable of doing real damage thousands of miles from where it started. On Kodiak Island, the sea pulled back and then surged forward again and again, lifting fishing boats clean out of the harbour and depositing them in the middle of town streets. That wave kept travelling through the night, moving across the open ocean at roughly the speed of a passenger jet. Tide gauges registered its arrival in Hawaii. It reached New Zealand. It touched the edges of Antarctica. And more than 4 hours after the earthquake struck, it finally reached a small lumber town on the far side of the Pacific, Crescent City, California. The first waves that rolled in there seemed mild, and people who'd gone down to look at the water started heading back to their homes, assuming the worst had passed. It hadn't. A much larger wave arrived later, tearing through the low-lying downtown near the harbour and killing about a dozen people. The heaviest death toll the tsunami caused anywhere outside Alaska itself. It was a brutal lesson that a tsunami is never a single wave, and that the later ones can be the deadliest of all. A lesson the whole West Coast would carry forward for decades. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the earthquake and its waves had killed more than 130 people across Alaska, Oregon, and California. For an event of this staggering magnitude, that toll was remarkably low, and the reasons come down largely to timing and luck. Sparse population, wood frame houses that flex instead of collapsing the way brick does, and a holiday evening that had emptied out the schools and offices that would otherwise have been packed with people. What followed that first night was, in its own way, just as remarkable as the quake itself. Power was out across the region, phone lines were down, roads were split open, and bridges had collapsed, cutting towns off from each other and from any outside help. Temperatures were dropping toward freezing, and thousands of people faced the night with no heat and no light. Aftershocks kept coming, 11 of them stronger than magnitude 6 within the first 24 hours alone, with smaller tremors continuing for more than a year afterward. And because the outside world barely understood the scale of what had happened, there was no meaningful outside rescue effort in those first critical hours. Alaskans simply took care of each other. Neighbors dug through wreckage for neighbors. Off-duty workers got emergency generators running. Doctors and nurses worked by flashlight. Radio operators became the entire communication network for the region, relaying word of who was missing and who was safe. It wasn't until daylight, when bush pilots took to the air, that anyone got a clear picture of how widely the destruction had spread along the coast. And when that daylight finally revealed the coastline in full, it showed something almost as strange as the disaster itself. The land had been physically transformed. Out on Montague Island, the seabed had been thrust upward by as much as 36 feet, exposing reefs and shoreline that had sat underwater for centuries. In other places, the land had dropped instead, several feet lower, swallowing forests and fields under rising salt water. Entire islands had been lifted. Harbours had become too shallow for the boats that used to dock there. It was, and still is, one of the largest single reshapings of a landscape ever precisely measured in the modern era. And it was precisely this transformed, upended coastline that turned Alaska into a scientific gold mine. Plate tectonics, remember, was still an unproven idea in 1964, a theory looking for physical evidence nobody had yet found. A young geologist with the US Geological Survey, George Plafka, arrived to map the changed coastline in painstaking detail, measuring exactly how much the land had risen or sunk at hundreds of points along the shore. What emerged from his measurements was a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. A broad band of coastline had lifted upward, while a parallel band further inland had sunk down, in a shape that matched only one physical explanation. One enormous plate of the Earth's crust had slipped up and over another along a gently sloping fault line, the Pacific seafloor diving beneath the North American continent, then lurching violently forward in a single afternoon. This was subduction, the exact mechanism that plate tectonics theory had proposed but never been able to prove. Plafka's careful fieldwork turned a devastated coastline into the clearest physical evidence the world had ever seen. for how the planet's crust actually moves. And the 1964 earthquake became the textbook example of a great subduction earthquake taught in classrooms ever since. The practical lessons landed just as hard as the scientific ones. Out of the wreckage came the first real tsunami warning system for the Pacific, built specifically to locate major earthquakes within minutes instead of hours, and get warnings out along the coast before the waves arrived. That system, expanded many times over since, still watches the Pacific today. Building codes across Anchorage were rewritten with Turnagain Heights and the collapsed downtown blocks in mind. Valdez and Chenega were both rebuilt on higher, more stable ground, their residents unwilling to trust the same shoreline twice. The financial damage from that one afternoon ran past $300 million in 1964 money, a genuinely staggering sum for the time and worth many billions today. But the real legacy isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in every life saved since, by warning systems, building codes, and hard lessons that only existed because of what happened on that Good Friday. The plates beneath Prince William Sound never actually stopped moving. The same kind of strain that broke loose in 1964 is quietly building again right now, in that same stretch of coastline and in similar subduction zones from Alaska down to the Pacific Northwest and across to Japan. The Earth keeps its own calendar, one that has nothing to do with ours, and at some point it will open that ledger again. What that single afternoon in 1964 really left behind isn't just a rewritten map or a settled scientific argument. It's a quiet, uncomfortable reminder of just how much confidence we place in ground we've simply never had reason to doubt.